Arlington,
No.
Texas.
Thank you. Acts 7.
We're in Acts chapter 6,
That's close.
and
6-8.
exactly, yes, 6-8 is where we're going to start. I'm going to do a quick recap in that there were two groups within the church that started to have some friction. And group number one were the Judean Jews who were born in that area, and they spoke Aramaic primarily, some Greek, and possibly some Hebrew, depending on how educated they happened to be. The other group was a minority of people called Hellenists who were born outside of Judea and moved into Judea, the majority of whom moved into Judea so that they could die there and be buried in Israel. Okay? And they spoke Greek and the language of whatever area they happened to be raised in. And because they had a significantly higher proportion of an aging population within their group, they started feeling like their widows were not being taken care of by the church as well as the Judean widows were. And as I pointed out previously, taking care of widows is a really, 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 really big deal for Jews until those Jews become Christians. And if the Jew becomes Christian, all of a sudden, the temple stops taking care of your widows. Which means the burden for taking care of the widows falls on the church. Okay? And so we had this minority group who had a whole lot of elderly. And again, just like today, the men die faster than women. So they'll move to Israel. And if you're going to move to Israel to be buried in Israel, might as well make it Jerusalem. Because nobody wants to be buried in Nazareth or Galilee. Nobody's moving there. So they're moving to Israel because, again, like I want to point out, in Jewish law, after somebody dies, you have to bury them within 24 hours of their death. Okay? So it is a lot easier to just be in Jerusalem when you die. And think about this. Think about if you're a Jew living in New York City and you want to be buried in Israel. You die, you have 24 hours to get your corpse from New York to Israel. People actually make plans for this kind of thing. But still today, Jews, when they get older, will go ahead and move to Israel so that they can be buried there. So these Hellenistic Jews were moving, elderly, into Jerusalem. The men were dying first because we're men. We have bad backs, we have high blood pressure, we have high cholesterol. Oddly enough, cholesterol is not the cause of heart blockage. It's inflammatory processes. So take your turmeric. Anyway, but men die first. That's the rule. And so these men were dying, leaving their widows behind. Widows were to be taken care of by the community, by the temple. Okay? If these widows converted to Christianity, they were no longer taken care of by the temple. They needed to be taken care of by the church. And so these Hellenistic Jews were like, hey, we got a whole bunch of widows here. We don't think they're being taken care of as well as the other widows. What are you going to do about it? So the apostles decided, okay, we got an idea. You guys, from your group, Hellenists, nominate 7 people that are of good character, full of the Holy Spirit. We'll vet them, and then they will be in charge of taking care of these widows and orphans, because we need to concentrate on, and this is very important the way that they put it, we need to concentrate on prayer and the spreading of the gospel. Notice how prayer comes first. And I pointed out to you last week how in Dr. Constable's commentary, he says how the church of our day, especially in the West, looks at the church of the first century and just marvels at all the amazing stuff that was done in that first century. And the difference between them and us is prayer. I know for a fact, and I am perfectly willing to lay this out here, put the cards on the table, I have a terrible, terrible prayer life. Awful. We're supposed to be praying continuously. And I can tell you for a fact I don't do that. Especially when I'm driving. I saw a meme on Facebook the other day. It says, if you're not swearing when you're driving, you're not paying attention to the road. Prayer is why such great things happened. And that was a huge thing for the apostles here. Prayer and spreading of the gospel. Think about Jesus in the Gospels, what he did. How often he was going off by himself. And when he was going off by himself, he was praying and meditating. And then he would go out and he would do, spread the gospel. And these guys are trying to do the same thing here, but they have this situation with these widows that needs to be taken care of. So they tell that group of people, you nominate people from within your group, we'll check them out, we'll vet them, and then they will be in charge of taking care of this stuff, because it is up to us. We can't be, and this is not to say that the job that they are doing is lesser. It is different. Okay? In the Marine Corps, there are different units, and there are some units that are infantry units that are involved in direct action against the enemy. There are also units that are support units that are involved in making sure that the direct action units have what they need to do what they need to do. Same thing here. Let me tell you something. If the Marine Corps did not have these logistics units, motor transport units, medical units, if they didn't have these organizations backing them up, they wouldn't be lasting very long on the front lines. Okay? It's just a fact. And I'm going to say something that's probably going to upset several Marines out there, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's true. If they didn't have the Navy, who provides the medical units, and in a lot of cases provides the transportation, they wouldn't be getting the job done. It's just a fact. Sorry guys, love you. Anyway, same thing here. Now, it's very important that they nominated these 7 guys from within this group. Why? Because they speak the same language. speaking the same language is extraordinarily important. We have two people in this room right now who have studied linguistics to a certain extent. I studied it to a certain extent, just a minor in it. Lana is an expert in it. But Lana can tell you, and I will tell you, when you study a language, you also study a culture. If you don't speak the same language, you don't understand the culture. Okay, as a perfect example, the Inuit that live in Alaska have, I think, like 15 different words for snow for different kinds of snow. Okay, we have one. It's called snow. Okay, they have like 15 different for snow. That tells you something about their culture and what is important to their culture. Okay? In Japan, there is no word for what we refer to in the West as love. They don't have it. They have several different words for honor and respect, but there is no word for love the way that we in the West have a word for love. But to take it one step further, the Greeks have several different words for love. It tells you about their culture. Language is important, and this is how these people were separated. They were separated by their language. Big, big barrier. So we're going to have these 7 guys. All 7 guys were vetted. If you will notice, when they go through their names, in verse 5, all of them had Greek names. Now, again, and this is potentially picking at nits, but we're going to do it anyway. Some people say that these guys are the first deacons of the church. The Greek term used in this particular passage for what they are doing is a descriptive term of what they did, kind of a verby type term for what they did, service. Okay? But they do not use the Greek word for servant, deacon. They don't use that word here. In 1 Timothy they do. So as I explained last week, these are actually the guys that came before the guys. These are the guys that set the precedent. There was a need, these guys filled it. And later in 1 Timothy we'll find out that need became greater. It's time to organize a permanent group of guys to do this job, which is what they did, and they became the deacons. So, like I said last week, these guys were the Navy combat demolition units and underwater demolition teams to the 1 Timothy Navy SEALs. They're the guys that came before the guys. Okay? And we can tell this because Stephen and Philip, the first two who are mentioned here in verse 5, Stephen and Philip, we find out were primarily evangelists. This was a part-time gig for them. Being evangelists was a full-time gig, which we're going to get into very shortly. Anyway, so that set the tone for what was going on. Okay. Verse 8. And Stephen, full of faith and power. Notice what comes first. Faith comes first. Faith comes first. In almost every miraculous act throughout all of biblical history, an act of faith comes before the miracle. Liam? No. Full of faith and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. Okay, remember what we go way back into the Old Testament. Signs and wonders. That's how you knew God was with a particular individual. That's how we know that God was with Jesus. And even the rabbinical writings of that time indicate that Jesus did great signs and wonders. They, however, attribute his great signs and wonders to acts of Satan. We're going to get to that in a little bit too. Then there arose some from what is called the synagogue of the freedmen, Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and those from Cilicia and Asia. Okay, we're actually stepping into just a little bit of controversy with this. This is one of those little bits of controversy that doesn't matter at all. But we're going to talk about it anyway. It doesn't matter at all. From this passage, and this is in the New King James Version, the way this is written, it indicates that there is one synagogue we're talking about here. There are those, and I've read commentaries that say both ways, there are those that say that there are actually 3 synagogues from here. Why would they say that? Okay, first thing is, the synagogue of the freedmen. Synagogue of the freedmen were Jews from Judea, whose parents actually were from Judea, who were taken into captivity when Rome came and took over. And then, at a certain point, all of the Jews were thought to be a huge threat to Rome. So a particular emperor kicked them all out of Rome. They were released from their service at that point, and they went home to Judea. Okay? But because they had been there for a couple of generations, they had kids who didn't speak Hebrew, who spoke Greek or whatever. But they were considered freedmen. They used to be slaves under the Romans. They were released from their slavery when they were kicked out of Rome, and they became the freedmen. Okay? Next we have Cyrenians and Alexandrians. These are Cyrenia and Alexandria, huge cities, huge metropolises, metropoli, I don't know, huge metropolises in northern Africa. They would be speaking Greek and whatever northern African dialect they spoke. And then we have Cilicia and Asia. Those were areas from Turkey. Okay? And they too would be speaking a different language. Now, given the information that has just previously occurred in chapter 6, we know that there are divisions among these people based on language. Now, granted, the freedmen, the Cyrenians and Alexandrians, and the Cilicians and Asians would all speak Greek. So it's distinctly possible that they all went to the same synagogue. At the same time, the freedmen, Cyrenians and Alexandrians, Cilicians and Asians, would speak completely different languages. Some Latin from Rome, some from northern Africa, some from Turkey. They would be speaking all of these different languages. And we know that speaking different languages leads to separation. So yes, they would all speak Greek, so they could have been all part of one synagogue. But they also spoke different languages, which were closer and more personal, so they could have come from 3 different synagogues. At the time of this writing, there were 329 active synagogues in Jerusalem alone. The rabbinical writings actually indicate that there were like 460 some odd in Jerusalem at that time. The 329, I think it's 329. I might be transposing the 9 and the 2. That comes from Josephus's writing. Now, Josephus has been known to be wrong on occasion. The rabbinical writings have been known to be wrong on more than one occasion. So anywhere between 300 and 400 different synagogues in Jerusalem alone. It is distinctly possible that all of these individuals were from different synagogues. It's also possible that they were all from the same synagogue. We don't know. But I am telling you this because it's a big deal, apparently, according to some people who are writing these commentaries. So I just want you to know, it's either way, it's possible, either way, doesn't matter. But this is getting you more in touch with the cultural situation that's going on there. All of these people speak the same language, but they speak different languages. Another thing that I want to point out is that somebody who is soon to emerge as possibly the greatest apostle of all time is from Cilicia. That's where he was born. He later settled in Tarsus, which is also located in Turkey, modern-day Turkey. And his name is Saul. He's going to come into focus here very shortly. Then there arose some from what is called the synagogue of the freedmen, disputing with Stephen. I can tell you right now, I love Stephen. I love Stephen. People tell me that Christians shouldn't argue. They're wrong. There was recently a story about a pastor who got fired because he put on the billboard outside the church that Bruce Jenner is still a man. This is not controversial in any way, shape, or form. It's a fact. It's a scientifically verifiable fact that Bruce Jenner is still a man. If I took some of his DNA, there would be an X and a Y chromosome. Likewise, if I took a Rolls-Royce hood ornament and stuck it to the top of my Nissan, it would not make my Nissan a Rolls-Royce. This is a scientifically verifiable fact, and one of my friends, he's a dear friend of mine, love him to death, served with him in the Navy for 6 years, said to me that he saw where I was coming from, but he felt that the way that the pastor went about it was incorrect. And that's not the way to share the gospel. Let me explain something right here, right now. The gospel is the truth. Okay? It is the truth. It's not a truth. It's not my truth. It's the truth. If you are talking to someone who is unwilling to accept the truth, if they are unwilling to accept facts, then you are wasting your time. If you are talking to someone who is unwilling to accept the facts, you are wasting your time. There are other ways to witness to them. But directly confronting them with the gospel is a waste of time. You are not doing yourself or anybody else any favors. God has other ways of getting to them. Those are ways that when We're doing stuff just in regular everyday life that these people are watching. And they're seeing how we behave. And they're thinking to themselves, wow, what does that individual have that I don't have? Seeds planted that hopefully we don't know anything about. But here we have Stephen. And these guys were disputing with Stephen. No, they were the ones disputing with him. And they were not able to resist the wisdom and the Spirit, big S, by which he spoke. And how could they? You can't argue with facts. You cannot argue against the truth. You can't do it. Oh, well, this Jesus was just a regular guy. Well, then how come he was able to do all these miracles? Well, he wasn't able to do... Yeah, he was able to do miracles. These guys all saw it. Everybody around here knows it. Well, he was just doing those miracles, by the power of Satan. Oh, really? Then how do you account for his resurrection from the dead? Are you suggesting that Satan has the ability to create life? Oh, that's a tough one. Well, he didn't really raise from the dead. He was, where was his body? Oh, the disciples came and took him away. Okay, yeah, they moved a 10,000-pound rock up a hill and defeated an entire platoon of Roman soldiers and then spirited his body away. Okay, fine. Let's say that happened. How is it he was walking around afterwards and upwards to 500 people saw him? Whoa. At that point, they're stuck. Now, they have two options. Actually, they have more than two options. One option is to accept the truth. 2 + 2 is 4. Water's wet. Sky's blue. Jesus rose from the dead. They can accept that. Another option, they can ignore the truth. This second option is where most people live their lives, ignoring the truth. La 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 la, I can't hear you, la 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 la, I'm not listening. That's where most people live their lives. The vast majority of people live their lives there. Then there's a rather extreme third option, which is you attempt to kill the truth. It didn't work with Jesus. It's not going to work against any of his people. They killed Jesus. Yeah, that's true. Publicly verifiable, historically verifiable, they killed him. That's true. It's also historically verifiable that he came back. It didn't work. Something that Gamaliel was kind of hinting at in his discussion with the Sanhedrin in chapter 5. And they were not able to resist the wisdom and the Spirit. No. The Spirit was involved. If the Holy Spirit, I'm going to tell you this again, like I've told you, if you're talking to somebody who is not willing to accept the truth, you're wasting your time. If the Holy Spirit is not behind what you're doing when you're sharing the gospel, you're wasting your time. The Spirit by which he spoke, then they secretly induced men to say. Where have I heard this before? We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God. Where have we heard that before? That's what they said about Jesus, isn't it? At the illegal trial at Caiaphas' house at night, they brought forth false witnesses, talking about how Jesus had been blaspheming God. They're doing the same thing here. These tactics have not changed since the beginning of time. If you will recall, the very first murder in all of recorded history was because somebody was doing what they were supposed to be doing. And somebody else didn't like it. Another rather interesting thing. I've already told you how when they brought Jesus to trial before the chief priests at Caiaphas' house, it was an illegal trial. And they're talking about blaspheming against Moses and God. If you will look in Levitical law, if you coerce false witness, especially in a court of law, you are blaspheming against Moses and God. So these guys were doing the exact thing that they were accusing Stephen of doing, even though Stephen wasn't doing it. Now, let's fast forward a long time in the future to a particular book written by a particular fellow who fancied himself a radical, and I'm quite certain is now roasting in hell, named Saul Alinsky. He wrote a book on rules for radicals, and one of those rules is that you accuse the other side of doing what you yourself are guilty of doing. This book, by the way, that Saul Alinsky wrote, I own it. If you open it up, it is dedicated to Satan. I am not kidding. The dedication reads along the lines of, this book is dedicated to Satan, the original radical. Not kidding. Sometimes it serves us well to read and understand how our enemies think. Just saying. That was written back in 1960 something. I can't remember. I think it was 62. I'm not sure. This here in 30 something, 33, 34. So over 1,000 years have passed. Nothing has changed. Why? Why has Satan not changed? Because what he does works. And they stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him, seized him, and brought him to the council. How much time we got here? Okay, good. So we've got another kangaroo court about to happen with Stephen. They also set up false witnesses who said, this man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place. They're in the temple at this point. This holy place and the law. For we have heard him say, this is starting to sound familiar too, hang on, that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs which Moses delivered to us. And all who sat in the council looking steadfastly at him saw his face as the face of an angel. Okay. This is not to say that Stephen was necessarily an attractive young man. I'm not saying he wasn't. I don't know the guy. Okay? What they are describing here is the same kind of thing that was seen on the face of Moses after he had been face to face with God. It was the same kind of thing that was seen when Jesus was transfigured. His face was shining. They are seeing this right before their eyes, and they are ignoring it. We can go back to the parable about the rich man and Lazarus, when the rich man says, surely if you send Lazarus back to tell my brothers, somebody rising from the dead will convince them. And Abraham said to him, no, not even that. If they're not convinced, and these are guys, this is why this is very important to understand. These are guys who know Jesus was resurrected. They know it. And they're ignoring it. If they won't accept that, they won't accept anything. That's fact one. Fact two means it also makes them direct, active enemies of God and God's people. It's not unlike, I don't know if you've seen the movie, I know you have. It's not unlike the Matrix. If you're plugged into the Matrix, if you are plugged into Satan's world system, you are automatically, by definition, an enemy of the God who made you. Whether you are malicious like these gentlemen are, or whether you just decide that I just don't want to deal with this right now. I don't have time to deal with this kind of stuff. I got a mortgage, I got kids, I got a job. I don't have time to deal with this kind of garbage. We're going to see all of those folks lined up right here. Ooh, do I want to go there right now? Yeah, why not? Chapter 7. Then the high priests said, "Are these things so? We are shocked, I say." Talk about a show. Why, this is just terrible. We're horribly offended at this, that anyone would be speaking such terrible things. And he said, and this is what's going to get him killed, by the way. The truth. The truth will set you free. That's true. The truth will also get you killed. Brethren and fathers, listen. The glory of God appeared to our father Abraham. Oh, okay. Talking about Abraham. All right. We're off to a fairly decent start. Okay. We accept that. When he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, "Get out of your country and from your relatives, and come to a land that I will show you." Can't argue with that. Quite so. Yes, Abraham. Yes, country. Fathers, brethren. Yes, right. Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. We're kind of jumping a little bit there. And we're also pointing out that Abraham did not do what he was told to do. Abraham was told immediately, get up, gather your stuff, leave the place, go to here where I tell you. Abraham did not do that. He waited around until his father passed away, then he did it. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. And this is where we're talking about Abraham believing what God said with no evidence whatsoever that it was going to happen, other than the fact that you've got this omnipotent being actually speaking directly to you, which for me, that would be good enough. If God started talking to me directly, I'd be okay. You're God, you win. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them for 400 years, which, by the way, actually happened. And the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. Unfortunately, that was being very optimistic. That's what they were supposed to do. But as we will recall, just a few days after being freed from bondage, what's the first thing those Israelites were doing? Grumbling against God. And then after they finally made it into the land that they had been promised, they failed to conquer it the way they were ordered to do, so they didn't get all of it. And B, they kind of hemmed and hawed as far as whether or not they were going to follow God. A lot. Then he gave him the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. And there was even some problems there. This form of debate was very, very common at the time. The reason being, and I love this form of debate, and I use this when I can, it lays a foundation that the other side cannot counter. All of this stuff that he said, the other side has to agree with. They have to agree. They cannot deny it. They cannot deny any of it. And in laying this foundation, he can build on what is currently at issue and show them that they can't deny that either. All of what he has said is leading up to the revelation of a Messiah. And there were hundreds of prophecies about this particular Messiah. And lo and behold, this Jesus guy, he fulfilled every single one of them. Now, I read an article recently that talks about the possibility, the probability, just from a mathematical standpoint, of Jesus just fulfilling 16 of the hundreds of prophecies that were told about him is infinitesimal, to the point of being impossible. But he fulfilled all of them. Except maybe a few that haven't come to pass yet. But at this point, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's got a 100% success rate up to this point. Guess what? Call Vegas. I know where I'm betting. And I'd love to do that too. I would love to do that, except for the fact I wouldn't be around to collect. Because if I'm right, I'm not going to be here anymore. And the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. Well, gosh, who would do that? I mean, that's just mean. That would almost be like, I don't know, taking somebody who's supposed to be your savior and hanging him on a tree or something. That'd be just awful. But God was with him and delivered him out of all his troubles and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now a famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. So Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers, and they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. Again, all he's doing here is laying down the facts. These are facts that are undeniable. 2 + 2 is 4. Water's wet. Sky's blue. But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose, who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. Gosh, killing a bunch of babies. Killing a bunch of babies, that's just awful. Who would ever do that? 40 million last year alone. Right here in River City. At this time Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God. And he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months, but when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Want to explain something real quick? This is frequently, well, most people don't understand this. At that time, Egypt was the nation. They ruled the known world. They had the military. And Moses was trained up with their military. Moses was basically a Green Beret. Which is why when it came time for him to ice somebody, he did it, and he did it well, and very efficiently. Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel, and seeing one of them suffering wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand. But they did not understand. A couple of things here. Note, it says he supposed that God would deliver his brethren by his hand. Whose hand? Not God's. Moses' hand. Moses figured that Moses was going to deliver his people for God. Well, he was kind of right, but not in the way that God figured. That's what we get when we start planning things out for God. if we decide to goot it ourselves, as Jennifer used to say, I goot it myself. If we decide to goot it ourselves, even if we're trying to goot it for God, more than likely we're going to mess it up. And remember, it took 40 years for God to drill that into Moses' head, to the point where Moses actually forgot. And God had to remind him. And when God reminded him, Moses was like, whoa, wait a minute. I can't do that. He argued with God?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do it all the time. He's still not listening to me. All right, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. We've got a little bit more ways to go here. But again, this is very important stuff. But one of the things that I really, really want to point out is that while Stephen is laying this stuff out, he's laying all of this stuff out that is indisputable, that these priests cannot argue with, and at the same time he is also showing how these forefathers that these priests so revere were constantly going against God. Constantly doubting, throwing Joseph, selling Joseph off to the Egyptians, constantly doubting. I'm sure he's going to get to the part here pretty soon where it talks about how the Israelites behaved themselves, or lack thereof, when they were finally let out of Egypt. So just because you're a high priest, and just because your father is Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and you're from whatever tribe you're from, does not make you right. And that's something that these guys held on to dearly. We are sons of Abraham, and that's what saves us. Abraham's righteousness trickles down to us by default. Wrong. Remember what John the Baptist said. You talk about being sons of Abraham. I tell you this, that God can raise up sons of Abraham from the rocks that are laying here at my feet. In other words, you're no better than these rocks. But we'll continue next week.